The oldest and strongest human emotion is fear, and the oldest and strongest type of fear is trepidation of the unknown. When we were children, our parents told us that monsters didn't exist, but we were sure that something was lurking under the bed or in the closet. Fear sees, even if our eyes are closed. Welcome to the realm of the arcane. My name is Lon Strickler. Join me as I examine unexplained creatures, strange manifestations, and remarkable realities. Imagine this next hour as a voyage of discovery to strange lands, seeking not for new territory, but for new knowledge of the supernatural. Come on board as we begin this adventure together. Hey folks, good evening and welcome to another episode of Arcane Radio. I am your host, Lon Strickler, and I thank you for joining me here on the Paranormal King Radio Network. Listeners can show their support for Arcane Radio by becoming a patron. Simply go to phantomsandmonsters.com and click the Podbean patron banner. Now, before I introduce my guests, I want to mention a series of events that have been occurring. There has been a humanoid flap in the Mount Vernon, Ohio area in recent weeks. Now, I recently received a report of a humanoid from the witness's daughter who contacted me. Now, this is the third encounter in the past month and a half in the Mount Vernon area. She states, "Hi, I'm reaching out, not as a hoax, but to let you know that I received a phone call from my mom in Mount Vernon, Ohio, recently telling me that she saw a figure of what appeared to be an alien come in one side of her basement and go out the other end of the basement. She described this thing as being tall with long arms, and she didn't see its face as she watched it go from side view, but she did say that the head looked like the one in a picture she attached, and it was from actually the picture I had from the last report, which looked like a tall gray. I wish to have her identity anonymous, please, if not to be contacted. I thought you might be interested to know that there have been other sightings in the area. My mom said she wasn't scared, nor did she feel any danger from this presence, and that it came in and left. Thank you." Now, I'm attempting to gather more information on this sighting. Now, like I mentioned before, this is the third encounter over the past month and a half. Now, the other two sighting reports came in through MUFON, and the actual descriptions were very similar. The one in particular, which was the second reported sighting, though it was the first sighting out of the three, came from a gentleman who stated, "I was driving home on the 31st of July 2018 at 1:43 a.m. on Ohio State Route 13 north of Mount Vernon, Ohio. A 7 to 8 foot tall, skinny humanoid-like creature ran across the road out of a cornfield across into a soybean field from east to west. I noticed the creature in my headlights about 50 to 75 foot away as I was traveling at a rate of 55 to 60 miles per hour. Now, as I came out of the cornfield, I immediately let off the accelerator. At first thinking it was a deer, but I hadn't seen the creature walk upright. It was, like I said before, it was 7 to 8 foot in height, tall, slender body, arms and legs small in diameter, hands and feet looked oversized for the body proportion, small neck with an oval elongated head, being dark to tan, light brown skin tone, and had no body hair. The creature slightly turned its head towards my vehicle's lights, and then I could see the creature's black eyes and small mouth. Now, it barely took 2 to 3 steps, and it was across the road at a tremendous rate of speed. I was in total shock and thought I'd check it out, first of all, and then thought of second, but then I finally decided to make a report. I lost sight of the entity due to the darkness. I'm a 24-year USAF retired air crewman with top security clearance. Now, not to be totally but would someone please advise me on what it was I may have seen? Well, like I said before, this was the original sighting. Another sighting was also reported to MUFON on August 17th. Very similar. This was in the area of Wolf Run Park, and it was seen by headlights in the woods. So I don't know what's going on in Mount Vernon, Ohio, but it seems quite unusual, very unusual, to get similar type reports like this in one area. You know, very similar to what I was getting in Chicago back in 2017 with the winged humanoids. So I don't know if this is something that's going to continue, but I will continue to look into it and get as much information as possible and report it. So let's get started. Tonight's guest, Mike Clelland, is a UFO researcher, experiencer, and author. Mike has written extensively on the subject of alien abduction, synchronicity, and owls. It was his firsthand experiences with these elusive events that have been the foundation for his research. His website, Hidden Experience, explores these events and their connections to the alien contact phenomenon. This site, also features over 200 hours of audio interviews with visionaries and experts examining the complexities of the overall UFO experience. Mike's books, The Messengers, Owls, Synchronicity, and UFO Abductee, and Stories from the Messengers, Owls, UFOs, and Deeper Reality, have been well received by the UFO researchers and enthusiasts. So, Mike, thanks for joining me.
Oops. Just a second. Crap, you there?
Yes, I am.
Oh, you can hear me. Okay, good. I took it. I had you. Forgive me. I had you on mute.
Yeah.
Thing there, and I just got a new phone here, and I'm pushing the buttons wildly. Yes, it's a delight to be here. Thanks so much.
Now, I don't know if you remember, but we talked after the release of your first book.
Yes, I do remember. That was an excellent interview. I remember. That was the first time we had ever talked.
Right, and can you tell the listeners how you became interested in the subject of alien abductions, synchronicities, and owls?
Well, so I'm sure I told you on the last time, but I'll try to make it quick here because that one, to tell the story correctly, takes a good long time. I'm 56 now. Turn the clock back to 2006, which is 12 years ago now. Right around this time of the year, in the autumn of 2006, I went camping with this friend, and it was someone I actually really hardly knew. And while we were camping, we saw 3 owls at sunset. And that's pretty unusual, but that's not that unusual. And then we had only gone out for one night, and these owls flew above us, they flew around us, they landed on branches near us, they landed on the ground near us. And then even when we laid down to go to sleep, it was a beautiful night. We just put our sleeping bags out under the stars, and these owls would swoop past our eyes and just blot out the stars for just a half a second. They were very quiet. It was incredibly cool. 4 days later, we went out camping again. At the time I was living in right near Grand Teton National Park, which is by Yellowstone. And I was living in Idaho at the time, and we went out camping again 4 days later at a completely different spot. The sun was setting. An owl flew by us. Another owl landed in a tree branch, and another owl landed at our feet. And this continued. They just kind of hung out with us for what must have been, 45 minutes. It was probably about 2 hours the first time. It was probably only 45 minutes the second time. But the second time they got really close. Now, they were close. They were like landing, not quite right at our feet, but very close. It seemed highly unusual. And at the time, I remember this very clearly. I had this thought in my head, and I didn't say it to anyone at the time because it seemed a little ridiculous. But I'm saying it now. I had the thought in my head was this has something to do with the UFOs. It's a very clear sense of knowing. It was almost like a voice in my head that was stating this has something to do with UFOs. I was looking at owls, and a voice in my head said this has something to do with UFOs. So now leading up to that point, I had a handful of experiences that sound very much like UFO contact, and I knew it. I had experiences as a boy of missing time and close-up UFO sighting, and I even when I was 30, I woke up in the middle of the night, sat up in bed. There was a bright light shining in the window. I was living in Maine at the time, and it was wintertime, and there was a bright light shining in the window, and I sat up and looked out the window. The way the bed was positioned, I could look right out the window, and there were 5 spindly, skinny, gray aliens walking towards the house, and they were backlit by this big bright light, and I heard this voice in my head that said, "Oh yes, they're here. Now is the time to put your head on the pillow and shut down." And that's exactly what I did. And the next morning, I dismissed it all as a dream and never even bothered to look and see if there were any footprints in the snow. So now those events and several other things, those are the 3 most telling events. I have a handful of other little things that were odd, had been kind of boiling or coming to a simmer, let's say. And the teapot was going to whistle. And this was at the point, this was kind of where I was at in about 2006. Like, I knew I was going to have to look into this someday, but I didn't want to address it. I didn't want to think about it. I did not want to go down that road. And the owls and that kind of message, I mean, that's the title of the book, The Messengers. That message, this has something to do with UFOs, kind of forced me into looking into the experiences, and I started talking to people and other researchers, and researchers would introduce me to people who had the experience. And one of the questions I asked everyone was, have you ever had any odd experiences with owls? It's certainly not 100% of the people, but it's enough that I started collecting these very, very strange stories. And those stories became, that's the thread that runs through both of those books. You know, one book's about 400 pages and one book's getting close to 300 pages. So we're looking at just a little bit under 700 pages of owl stories.
Right.
And that's a lot. And so whatever's going on, I feel very strongly I can say there is a connection between UFOs and owls. Now, what that connection might be, it's very murky, but I can say I feel strongly there is a direct connection between UFOs and owls.
Do you believe you were chosen to deliver this message?
That is an excellent question. Now, do I believe? Well, let me. It's hard to believe, right? Because that sounds so pompous in a way. But what I can say is it sure feels like things were orchestrated and staged in a way. It seems like somebody was aligning the pieces on the grand chessboard, and they were all aligned in a way that these stories fell into my lap in a perfect way for these books to be created. Yeah. So do I believe it? I entertain the idea, and it sure feels like that, but it's a tough one to say, do I believe it? Yeah. So was I picked? Was I chosen? Was it all pre-planned? It sure feels like it was orchestrated by someone, looking down into this reality, someone that we can't perceive, and they pulled a lot of strings and made it happen. So yeah, so that's my sense. There's no way to prove that, obviously, but that's how it feels.
Well, when you first started looking into this after you had your experience in 2006, what were some of the early reactions that you received from people as far as their experiences as well?
Well, the reaction I was getting was kind of like, this is really interesting because I've had the same thing too. And now, I didn't invent the connection between UFOs and owls. It was out there. Whitney Strieber wrote about it in Communion. Bud Hopkins wrote about it. So owls show up as a screen memory in a lot of UFO contact events, right? So the classic kind of story would be, someone's driving home at night and they see a big owl in the road. And they think, boy, that's strange. And they get all the way home. And then instead of arriving home at midnight, they arrive at 2 a.m, and it doesn't make any sense. And then perhaps one day they go through hypnotic regression, and the hypnotherapist says, describe this owl in the road. And the witness says, well, the owl is skinny, it's bald, it has big black eyes, and it's got a tight-fitting spacesuit on, and I don't think that's an owl. the implication is that there's some sort of screen projection, some sort of projected hypnotic vision that the people think they're seeing an owl, and instead they're seeing, or excuse me, they think they're seeing an owl, but what's actually hidden is a gray alien.
Right.
Now that's very common. Now it could also be a deer. It could be people see firemen on the side of the road, or they'll see, giant squirrels. There's all kinds of things that show up in this. But at the top of the list is owls and deer. So someone could certainly, but what I'm more concerned about, in a way, with this research is the real owls that seem to be showing up in connection with these stories. And sometimes it's hard to piece those apart. Now you asked a different question, and I got a little off track. What was the question you asked?
I can forget what I asked.
Yeah, I forget too. Yeah.
I wanted to know what the reaction was from some of the earlier.
The reaction was people were very, they were kind of like, well, here's my owl story, because I had a website and I started putting a little thing on my website, and I was doing podcasts, and right at the top of my thing it says, I want to hear your owl stories, and so I was actively seeking these owl stories, and I was getting them, and they were the one of the very first ones I got, which is very benign and simple compared to how strange they get, was this guy named Derek, and he's camping in the desert with his buddies, and they're lying there. They got a little campfire going, and they're looking up at the stars, and he's the first time he ever camped in the desert, so he's kind of blown away by how awesome the stars are. And then they look up the top of this cactus, and looking down at them is this owl, and they don't remember it landing there. And it's got this kind of sinister vibe, which is very commonly reported. Everyone recognizes that. Sometimes you see an owl in a tree, and it's just a bird, but it feels intense. And so the owl flew off, and moments later, a triangle-shaped UFO, a triangle-shaped craft, flew directly over them, and then flew off and kind of hugged the terrain. And I sat with him, and he worked very hard to sort of articulate how this thing flew, how it actually hugged the landscape. And then we talked a little more, and kind of he told me some more stories. He told me some stories that sounded suspiciously like abduction stories.
Right.
He had dreams where he was lifted out of his bed and floated through his wall. His girlfriend had, she said, well, I kept my eyes closed the other night because I knew you weren't in the bed, and I knew, but I had to keep my eyes closed. And what a weird thing to say, So, and then in among all this, he said, oh, and then I went through a spiritual awakening. So there's all these like odd, life events that, the owl story is one thing, but in the UFO story, but then there's all these peripheral things that, imply that he may have had like long-term contact. So that what he's describing certainly sounds like a real owl, it doesn't sound like a screen memory. It was owl-sized, and it flew away, and it was just doing something an owl would do. It certainly wasn't 4 foot tall, like people report the screen memory owls being. So yeah, so this is hard to that was one of the initial stories I got. So the people were very eager to tell these stories. People, like, basically they had this strange story that they had never attempted to make sense of, and people were coming to me like, can you help me make sense of these stories? And it was very difficult because I really had no answers, but I could, especially more recently as I've collected more, I could help with saying like, okay, so this, what you've reported here shows up in other stories, so you're not alone in this. And I think there's a solace that comes from that when I can say that to folks.
When your first book came out, we talked not long after that. My experience was seeing owls and receiving references to owls preceding my wife's passing. And but after that, now this is something we hadn't discussed yet, I had 2 encounters with tall gray beings, including a possible abduction. Then not long after that, I started receiving the reports of the winged humanoids in the Chicago area, and in which some of these beings were actually described as lacusas, or large owl-like humanoids.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm trying to figure if this was all connected somehow. This series of sightings in Chicago, which at this point right now is over 70 sightings, Uh, I don't know if I was chosen somehow to receive these reports. It sure seems that way. You know, uh,
Let me just interrupt. I know more. Like just what you're saying, I'm kind of nodding here knowingly, like, yep, that sounds like. So yes, so I understand that feeling of like wondering whether it, if it was orchestrated for you in particular.
right. It sure does seem that way. I mean, because it's interesting that, of course, I solicited the sighting reports. I put it out there that if something was seen in the Chicago area, I wanted to know about it, and I was getting the reports. Now, my other colleague, Manuel Navarrete, he was also getting reports, but it was interesting that our small group were getting all the reports. Now, there were a few early reports that came from MUFON, but beyond that, and of course, since some of these sightings were very related to owls, just got me thinking, wow, something is definitely going on here.
Well, and then there's the owl man sightings from England from the
Right.
early 1970s, mid 1970s, and then there's even the Mothman sightings, which could have, I don't know how it got the name Mothman, but it certainly could have been just called Owlman,
Right.
because it sort of had that sense about it. So it sounds like Mothman and Owlman from England are very similar, and it sounds like this Chicago thing could very much fall into that, that kind of Mothman-like apparition.
Well, I believed for some time, and even before all this happened in Chicago, I believe for some time that the Mothman or similar winged humanoids are summoned creatures by either some type of strong spiritual presence or even an otherworldly energy. That they may be guardians or sentinels of some type, as opposed to being what many people think they're harbingers or portents of doom. Of course, the story is the collapse of the Silver Bridge was a result of either the sightings of the Mothman or that it was a harbinger before the event, and it's come up before. Now, I know the owl as an archetype is said to be a type of harbinger of either death or some type of something bad going to happen in the future. Of course, a lot of the Native American tribes, well, throughout, believe this as well, especially the Navajo. I've talked to several people in the Navajo Nation who have talked about this with me. Do you think that, have you heard of anything that may seem to think that it's some type of harbinger other than a messenger?
Well, that's certainly the folklore of it.
Right.
Right. So that's the folklore of it, especially, but not everywhere. Right. Some folklore is very different. So where I'm up in upstate New York here, and the Native American tribes around here have a different take on the owl. It's much less a harbinger of doom, and it can be certainly seen as a sign. Now, what I found, and I've got a lot of reports about owls, and many of them involve, associated with death, but it's usually the owl showing up after the death
right.
of someone. And it's almost always kind of life affirming for folks to be. I mean, I have a wonderful story. I'm paraphrasing here a little bit from memory. A woman contacted me, and she, there was a civic leader in a city in Florida, and he died, and they had a memorial in the city park, and he was kind of a beloved character in the park, in the town, and so a great number of people turned out for this memorial. Now, it was nighttime, and an owl flew and sat on a lamppost in the middle of the park at this memorial, and everyone saw it. Everyone took pictures of it. It was interesting. The woman was an author for she wrote a newspaper article, and she said, like I mentioned the owl, but I couldn't really say what really happened. When what happened was people lined up and talked to this owl, and they basically said, I cannot remember the fellow's name. Like, John, thank you for it's really great that you came back say goodbye to everyone. And then people would basically walk up one at a time and talk to this owl on a lamppost like it was their dead friend, and they said goodbye. Now, this is actually surprisingly common. That's a really strong example, but so people will talk to the owl as if it's their dead relative, and they find peace from that. So those are the kinds of stories I'm hearing. I am certain that there are other stories where owls show up before someone died or at the same moment. That's actually something I've gotten before, where the owl hoots or something like that, and at the same moment that someone died, the person died of completely natural causes, but the owl was was there at that moment. I do know I have some stories where owls have shown up shortly before someone was died in an accident. So yes, you could certainly take it as that the owl was a portent of something bad. But I don't have many examples of that in my records.
Yeah, it just seems to me that the winged being in general has some type of connotation of foretelling something is going to happen. Yeah, I'm not necessarily saying something bad, but that something is going to happen.
Yeah, and I'm trying to think of did anything happen in the events around the Owlman sightings in England? Was there some? I mean, the Silver Bridge is such a tidy story where it has that sort of as the culmination of all of this, and it's so I'm not sure what to. This is testable in a way. If something bad happens in Chicago, then we and I hope nothing does bad happen.
And believe me, I've had people. It's interesting when this started to happen. It actually started back in March of 2017, and it was really gathering momentum. And I, honestly, in July and August, I was receiving between 20 to 30 calls per day of people concerned that something terrible was going to happen in Chicago. People were frightened. It was the damnedest thing. I was, and I'm trying to discount, the whole thing. People heard about the Silver Bridge collapse and the Mothman, and that this was a portent of death or whatever, and it was absolutely amazing how many people were continuously calling me.
Well, and they have. I mean, honestly, these are spooky stories. They have a right to be frightened too. So that doesn't surprise me. And that was my first thought too. Was like, oh no, like what's going on in Chicago? But nothing has happened. And I think that these things play out with this. It's not written from the same script in a way, right? This is you get these things and it doesn't follow. So yeah. So I have another witness who saw something very similar to the Owlman. He called it a Mothman, and he was in England. And he said it emanated this vibe of something absolutely sinister. Like it had a strange vibe to it. Like just seeing it, he was overcome with this sense of horror. And then he actually had a lot of bad luck in his life after that.
Right.
Yeah. Is that associated with these reports at all? Like a premonition or a feeling of doom or anything like that?
Well, I did mention this to you the last time I talked to you. About a month after my wife passed away, my grandmother passed away. And my father was telling me the night before she passed, he heard an owl on the property. He had never heard an owl all the years he was living. He was almost 80 years old by then. He lived there all his life. He had never seen or heard an owl. But the night before she passed, he heard this owl in the tree next to his window, and it woke him up, and he didn't understand it. And he told me about it after her funeral. I had no idea about it. And I thought, well, that's the damnedest thing, him bringing that up, because I never saying to him about, all the references to an owl before my wife died. So there you go. Maybe that is what it was. I don't know.
Yeah, well, that's certainly, so that matches what would be and there's lots of lore about that. I mean, in Ireland, like the hooting of an owl out the window means, but owls hoot all the time, right? So I mean, but I live in a place right here where I'm up in upstate New York, and there's a lot of owls here, and we live in the forest, and so we hear owls all the time, and that's, but to highly unusual if you've never heard one before, and then the night before your spouse passes, that's very, very, that's very telling.
Yeah. Now, in your new book, you mentioned owl encounters in Wiltshire, which is a county well known for crop formations. Do you believe that these messengers are connected to the formations?
It's funny because I actually have very few accounts of owls in crop circles.
Right.
I thought it'd be perfect. Doesn't sound perfect. They should be, but
yeah,
there's actually very
think.
few. Yeah, you sure would. And there's actually the only and the only story I really have. Well, actually, that's not true. I have a couple. In there's a fellow who's actually, many people consider him they're skeptical of his claims, and his name is Robert van der Hoeven, I think is his name, and he's a young Dutch guy, and he had some events with owls. They were like driving. So he's this fellow, if his stories are to be believed, Robert van der Hoeven, and I think he was with scientists who were with him, who were basically, or researchers who were trying to like discredit him, who were there to, if he was hoaxing something, they were trying to catch him. So they were driving at night, and he had this vision of a crop circle, and he said, it's over here, and they're driving at night, and he said, well, it's just kind of so he was trying to find it, and as they were driving, an owl swooped across the road, and they stopped the car, and they followed in the direction the owl had flown. We walked into the field at night, and there was a crop circle there, and that's how they found it, from an owl. So yes, there's a few stories like that, but not as many as I had hoped for.
Right.
The story that begins the crop circle country stuff, that's a wonderful story that does actually culminate in a crop circle and begins with an owl. And there's the people also, their husband and wife team, Bert Jansen and his wife Heather Kluit-Jakowski, are driving at night. They're running a tour of ancient sites in England, and specifically not a crop circle tour. And they are driving home after having dinner, and they're about to meet the group. They're going to Stonehenge the next morning before dawn. And they're driving at night, and an owl crosses in front of their windshield, and they follow it down the road, and it leads them to a spot, and then it leads them to another spot, and then they're like, how did we get here? Why did we get to this spot? And then the fellow Bert doesn't see it, but his wife sees what amounts to like the hellhound, like the hound of hell, this giant dog monster, lumbers out of the tall, crop on one side of the road, crosses the road in full vision for her. He doesn't see it, and then it walks into the forest or into the crop on the other side of the road. And this story is a beautiful example of how these stories, they get very, very complicated. And you must sense this too when you do this research. Like these stories seem to have like every thread you pull on seems to lead to some other strange aspect of the story. And that's what was difficult when I worked on the first book, was that aspect of how do you rein this stuff in? I had to make my point. So you talk to someone on the phone for 6 hours and they tell you these amazing stories, and then you would put in a paragraph about their owl sighting, and there was a lot more there. So that was and it broke my heart. So that was the point of the second book, was to tell these longer, more complex stories. And yet, there's some fleeting references to owls in crop circles, but not as much as I had hoped, or I had suspected, let's say. It just seems like it's such a good fit, but it doesn't really play out that well.
And this is one thing that's fascinated me over the recent years as far as doing research into the paranormal and, other aspects of the supernatural, and because a lot of these phenomena seem to be connected somehow. And, you talk about the synchronicity, I can't even say it half the time, but, the relationship between, you say, UFOs, owls, and other phenomena. I see it all the time. It's it's surprising, sometimes frustrating, but it happens. And I talk about it with people all the time. You know, we see one thing, then something else happens, and it's connected to something else. And I think you found that out as well with one of the stories that you have in the new book, as far as actually a Sasquatch connection.
And which story was that?
I don't know. Was it? It was either Susan McLeod or Denise Lynn.
Oh yes, of course. Yes, Susan McLeod. Yes.
Right.
That's the one. Oh God. Yes. That was so. Forgive me. I was just like, wait a minute, because I just read the entire book aloud, and I feel like I'm like, oh my God, I'm so intimate with every word of that book now. So I read it aloud and recorded it. But yes, so that story. She had Susan McLeod's this wonderful woman she's kind of become she's got Native American heritage. I guess she's Canadian, so they call it First Nation heritage there. And she was her friend of hers had died, and so she went and she had a teepee on her property in the woods in Ontario, and she was beating a drum and had a little fire going and burning sage, and she felt something push the back of the teepee, and she thought it was a bear or something like that. She kind of felt like it was big, and she said she could even smell something. Mm-hmm. And so she stepped out of the teepee and she looked out there, and there were 5 Bigfoot, 5 Sasquatch standing, and she said they were standing like they were posed for a photograph. The 2 big ones in the back and the 3 young ones in the foreground, and just like a family portrait. They were standing totally still, and she freaks out and she goes back in the teepee and pounds the drum really loud and puts more wood on the fire, and then she eventually peeks out and she sees that the same Sasquatch are now down a little further away. Like her sense is they didn't want to scare her, so they moved away, and they were still standing in that same frozen pose. So she runs to the house. She wants to tell her kids, and as soon as she opens the door, the kids are like, Mom, there's like these black shadow demon things flying around the house. And she's like, oh my gosh, she's she gets some sage and she does a little ritual and she burns sage and runs from room to room. And she's like, oh my God, this is so strange. I can't tell my kids what I just saw. So she runs to find her husband. Her husband's in the garage, which he's got a woodworking shop there. So she goes to open the door, and the door's locked. He never locks the door. And he'd actually propped something into the door so that the door was closed. So he had to come and not only unlock it, but pull like this wood that had locked, propped the door closed. And he was like, what is going on? There's these black shadow beings in here. There's these things are flying around. There's things looking in the windows. He was totally freaked out. So she's like, oh my God, I can't tell him either. So she steps away from the garage for just a second and she literally says, she prays to God for an answer. And as she does, she looks up and there's a triangle craft hovering above her driveway. And then she says it's even like flitting out and in and out of reality a little bit. Now there's no owls in this story. She has plenty of other stories with owls. And I said, what was going on in your life at the time? And she said, oh my God, I was seeing so many owls that summer. And that's how we met, was through owls and this story. Because when I heard that story, I was like, oh my God, there's got to be an owl connection there somewhere. And the connection basically is that she had been seeing a lot of owls that summer and has also in her own personal experiences had a bunch of paranormal events with owls, often involving death. So yeah, her owl stories involve death. Yeah. So yes, my sense is that there's this grand wheel, right? And every giant spoke of the wheel, you could put a little label on it. This comes from a guy fellow named Ray Hernandez who had this vision, and I'm just paraphrasing what he said, which I think is a tidy way to sum it up. In one spoke of the wheel says, UFO accounts. The other spoke of the wheel says, shamanic visionary experiences. The other one says the near-death experience. The other one says out-of-body experiences. The other spoke says has meditative experience. The other one says psychedelic drugs. And somehow they're all connected. We can only look at one spoke at a time, and that's all we can focus on. But all those spokes are connected to a center hub, a center axis. And that's where the mystery is. That's what I want to know. What's going on at that center core hub? That's generating all these associated phenomena. You have a ghost researcher. They don't talk to the Bigfoot researcher. The Bigfoot researcher doesn't talk to the UFO researcher. So you've got these disparate disciplines, but I think they're all got some core source.
Well, it doesn't surprise me. This is something that I've been been reading and hearing from witnesses for years now. This type of connection to a different type of phenomena. You know, it's interesting, and I forgot to mention this. Not long before the sightings in Chicago began, and this was maybe the year after my wife had passed, and I had seen these owls and such. And I didn't mention any of it at that time. I wasn't mentioning any of this to anybody. I started receiving little stone owl totems in the mail from different people. Don't know why. I received 3 of them.
Different people.
Different people. So I took each one of these owls and put it in a little leather bag, and I carry them with me. I have them with me right now. And you know, there's another thing that you had written in your book that I thought was very interesting. When I received these owls, I put a piece of moldavite in each one of them. And the person in your book, Allison, she mentioned moldavite. It kind of blew me away when I read that the other day.
That was I think that was Laura Bruno.
Okay.
Who mentioned moldavite, and she it gets so, like, this story gets so knotted up where she was given a moldavite pendant, but she said she had such a strong reaction to it. She had she couldn't wear it, and
right.
Then she had a basically she was in the toilet paper aisle at the grocery store, and she slipped and fell into a shelf and went boom, 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 and fell down the shelf on her and landed on her butt. And she said it hurt so bad that she had this Kundalini awakening from slipping and falling. And then she put the moldavite. She had heard a voice in her head that said, "Wear the moldavite pendant," and then she wore it for a month, and she heard this voice in her head that said, "The moldavite pendant has done its job." I'm paraphrasing from memory, but so that's very interesting. And moldavite, it's from a meteorite that landed somewhere. I want to say in
Czechoslovakia
or something like that. Czechoslovakia, yeah. So
yeah.
And what is so? Here's literally, it's something from outer space.
Right, it's very rare. I mean, a very small piece it costs you a fortune. I mean, but I happen to have 3 small pieces, and something told me to put each one of those pieces into one of those bags. And when I read it in your book, I thought, oh my God, there's another connection. Something else Mike has written that connects to what happened to me. And you talk about the Kundalini rising. Basically, you've talked about that twice, I think, in the book, where that has been brought up. And
2 times in the book, yeah.
Yeah, and I just thought that was amazing. I really did. I had also started shamanic journeying at this time. And I was just starting to get into shamanic journeying because I wanted to find what my power animal was. Even though I've been having all these connections with owls and, I never even dreamed that I had a connection with it. And I went through the shamanic journey, and my power animal was an owl.
Well, so now this. You didn't tell me that, but I don't think you mentioned the shamanic journeying before.
No, I didn't, because this happened after I talked to you.
Because this is so owls and shamanism. I feel like that could be its own big fat book. Owl shamanism and the connection there. There's so many stories between owls and shamans, and so shaman is a funny term, right? So there's I guess there's shaman-like activities, right? So I think I would consider Reiki healing sort of shaman-like. It's obviously not the shaman. I think the definition of shaman is exactly what you said. The shaman has to do something to benefit the village, the tribe, the neighbors, his friends, his community, and he does it by journeying whether it's through psychedelics or whether through meditation or whether through rhythmic drumming. But he does this journey, and then you come back with an answer. That's the story of the owl too. The owl is a messenger. It flies to some other realm, and that's the metaphor for owls flying in the dark. Right? So owls fly in the dark. That ancient man must have thought that was amazing, and that turned into flying to the land of the dead, flying to the land of the ancestors, flying to the land of the gods, and then returning with a message. Now that's my whole story starts off with seeing an owl, hearing a voice in my head that says, this has something to do with the UFOs, and my life changed. Like my life has completely flip-flopped from that event, where now I cannot tell you how much time I spend every day answering emails or getting back to people or trying to archive these stories. And it's been, and I mean, what am I telling you? You know exactly what I'm talking about. You're living it too. We're essentially doing the same thing with a different, slightly different focus.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I mean, it's something I didn't expect, and what started it, I don't know. I mean, was it because, like something telling me that, something was going to happen to my wife eventually, or, and it turned into these alien encounters and experiences, then to the fact that people started sending me totems. And then I decided, well, I wanted to learn shamanic journeying because I was, wanted to get into healing somewhat. And then it turns out that through the shamanic journeying, my power animal turns out to be an owl. So who figures? I mean, it's strange. But it's part of me doing this as long as I've done it. The connections between all these weird phenomena. I mean, I guess it's, it's just part of everything. I mean, I think that this is just something else that connects a lot of this together.
And I think that's a symbol. I think the owl is a symbol. Now, I haven't talked about this yet, and I'll just tell this here, but I went through a hypnosis session recently, and the stuff I'm not going to talk about because I haven't really fully processed it yet, and I don't quite believe it. And but it was with Yvonne Smith, and this is in Los Angeles, and she's a hypnotherapist who specializes in abductees.
Right.
And so in one sense, a friend of mine kind of said, well, if you go to her, you know what you're going to get. And I said, well, sort of. And he was implying that like you're going to hear the story that gets generated from this type of hypnotherapy, but at the same time, she's a very soft-spoken, sweet, compassionate woman. And so I said, listen, in the middle of this thing, I want you to throw in, what do the owls mean? Just put that in there somewhere when I'm under the hypnosis thing. So she did it halfway through. She said, and what do the owls mean? And I said, and this is under hypnosis, and I just blurted this out. I said, the owls don't mean anything. The owls are unimportant. The owls, and this took a long time to get out. I'm saying it nice and smooth here, where I can, but hypnosis, trying to transcribe a hypnosis session is deadly dull because there's these long, long pauses between everything. So, but I said, the owl is unimportant. The owl doesn't mean anything. The owl is a symbol. The owl is a symbol that is thumbtacked to a door. The door is what is important. We are in a claustrophobic hallway on one side of the door. You open that door with the owl on it, with the symbol of the owl. The door is important. The owl is not important. On the other side of that door is this grand vastness.
Mm.
And I thought, like, even in the moment, like I'm under hypnosis and I'm like just blurting this stuff out. I'm not thinking about it. I'm just like, and I'm like going, yeah, like you write, every once in a while when you write something, you get kind of that little, right on, this sounds good. And I was right in the moment in the like laying on the couch there. I was like, yeah, baby, this is good stuff. But so that was a really nice way to look at it. The owl is unimportant. It's the symbol that's on the door. The door is what's important. So that is a very pleasant, tidy way to sum that up. So
now, in the title of the book, you mentioned the words deeper reality. Now, is this spiritual or is this something different?
Well, it certainly could be. You're like, you got 1 foot across the spiritual line when you say something like that. What I'm thinking is, you know what it actually was? When I wrote the book, I had the working title was Owls, UFOs, and Consciousness.
Mm.
And when the book was pretty much done, I went through and I did a little word search for the word consciousness. And it didn't really show up. I didn't really say it that often. It's not in there. It's not in the book. I don't talk about consciousness at all, really. And but I did talk about a deeper reality. And the deeper reality would be that I said it earlier, there's like a grand chessboard. And someone or something or some energy or whether it's God or the gods or whatever term you want to use, or the aliens or the spirit entities or the angels, whatever term you want to use, is kind of stage managing this grand chessboard. And that's whatever's going on, where that stage managing is going on, it ain't here. We're here in this physical world. There's some bigger reality that takes place there. And so some of these stories just get so overlapping and they loop back on each other in this way that is so improbable and could not be random. And what I was left with was, for me, the details of these stories this is for me, they are proof of a deeper reality. It might not, I'm certain there's scientific pragmatists that would not go down that road. But for me, it's proof of a deeper reality. Is spiritual? Sure. Yeah, you're got 1 foot in the spiritual. Deeper reality might be a physicist might be able to define, a multidimensional universe in a different way than a nun or a monk at a monastery.
Mm. But why owls? Out of all the different creatures on this earth, why owls?
That question, oh my God, that question I wrote it over and over again. I put it in italics in the first book. I did a little word search and just said, why owls? ? Boom. And so I came up with 4 answers. I should be able to do this off the top of my head. I don't want to grab the book off the shelf. The first one would be, owls are an alarm clock. They are there to wake you up.
Okay.
So that's symbolic, right? There's obviously an alarm clock and an owl are 2 different things, but an owl plays the role of an alarm clock. I had that experience in the mountains with my friend, seeing 3 owls, 2 different nights, 4 days apart. That woke me up. I'll tell you, it woke me up to a deeper reality. Like, I recognized in the moment, the second time especially, this was not normal. This was something far too bizarre. And there's all kinds of synchronicities. To tell that story properly takes a half hour. The second reason would be, the owls are here to announce initiation. And this is, I have a lot of stories, especially shamanic initiation. People going through shamanic initiation where owls will show up. This is so strange. I haven't said this, but I think I have 4 accounts of owls showing up in a shaman's house. They don't know how it got there. Like, they walk into the room and there's an owl in the house. They don't know how it got there. I mean, obviously, any number of things could have flown, but they were like, no, the windows were closed, the chimney was closed, the fireplace was closed. We don't know how the owl got in here. 4 accounts like that, and these people are all shamans. That to me, that and pull on those threads. I don't know what that leads to, right. But I'm jumping ahead. So shamanic initiation is where you get that. So, and the other one is the owl's an archetype. Right? So there's a deeper meaning for owl embedded in our psyche, embedded in our either our subconscious or our collective consciousness. There's a meaning that we can't articulate, but we know in our heart and soul, in a very deep place. And the owl, when an owl shows up, the owl is the key, and we have a little lock that the owl can unlock in our psyche somehow. And the fourth one was, I got to do this now. I can't remember it. I'll remember this in a second. Anyway, so, but that's, yes. So the question why owls, that's a very important question to ask. I don't have a good answer. I have to kind of dance around it with these other answers.
Yeah. Well, it's fascinating. I mean, you know, I've asked myself the same thing, and of course, I know you have, and I have no real good answer for it. There must, you know, I don't know if it's because, you know, the owl is supposed to be wise. Why is the owl so wise? Why does the owl mean these so many different? I mean, you know, when you go back to the Sumerian religion and Lilith is with the owls, why are the owls with her? You know, this supposed demon, or, you know, the first woman supposedly. What was that all about? I mean, so I have myself looked into owls more deeply, but I tell you, the more I look, the more confused I am, to be quite honest with you.
And same with me. I'm like, I mean, I'm totally baffled. I'm more baffled now than I was at the beginning, because what's happening now is I'm getting, like, people are like, you get story after story after story. I've gotten some amazing stories, I'm flooded. Like, I can't keep up. I actually had to create a little form letter that said, you know, thank you for contacting me. Sadly, I'm so overloaded that I have to answer with this form letter. I hate sending that back. I much prefer to give each person a little personal attention, but I just cannot keep up with it. And they're all owl stories, and they're all worthy of their own novel, basically.
Yeah.
You know, these are powerful, important human experiences. So here's what I argue in the second book, is that these experiences with owls, your experiences with owls, my experiences with owls, especially with your journeying, your shamanic journeying, my sense is that, you know, people tell me these weird stories with owls, like, oh my God, this owl showed up at this perfect moment. It was synchronistic. It had this thing, and they're not all with UFOs. Some of them might be with other powerful life events, death or shamanic initiation, or, you know, those kind of. So my sense is that people all throughout human history have had these stories. Those stories were the seeds, and from those seeds emerged the mythologies. Now, the mythologies don't all match up, right? So the mythologies from the Indians in the desert Southwest are different from the natives in Quebec. But there's a subtle thread and death is one of the things that seems to be universal with all owls. Now, owls come out at night and death, and I don't think it's too much of a stretch to go down that road. But but I argue that these stories are part of the human experience. They are the genesis of the mythologies that arose. Now, those mythologies are all in books on shelves, and you know, people studying this kind of thing all treat it very academic, and it's like this old thing that's long gone. But you know, we live in a world without mythology now, in a way, right? We've replaced that with science and being practical and pragmatic and stuff. But I'm saying that the stories are still happening. People are still having these experiences with owls.
Mm. So, Mike, how can people read about your research, and how can they get your books?
Well, you can. So, the easiest thing to do is you can type in UFOs and owls into Google, and my name is going to be the first thing that comes up, and then you scroll down, it's going to be the next 15 things that come up. So, and then, if you're anywhere in the world and you have an experience with UFOs and owls, you're going to find me. I'm like 2 mouse clicks away, and so you can find me that way. We can go to MikeClelland.com, and which I don't want to use that for much. I just got that domain name, but the core amount of my research is on a site called hiddenexperience.blogspot.com. That's hiddenexperience.blogspot.com, and I got a lot of stories there. And then if you just look online, and you can go right to Amazon and look up The Messengers, Owls, and the book will come right up.
Well, Mike, thanks for joining me tonight. I hope we can talk a little more than we had before. It's been about 2 years since we talked the last time. Maybe we can talk again in the near future. Yeah,
and the shamanic thing has been at the core of my present research. So when you dropped the shaman bomb there, I was like, whoa, this is exactly like, how do you say, when you go down the river, you just follow the current. Just let the current pull you
Right.
downstream. Don't fight the current if you're on a little rowboat or something. And that's where I'm at. I'm like, I'm not fighting the current. And it's all leading me down this shamanic thing. So when you said that, I was like, wow, this is right in line with everything I'm finding. So.
Well, I'm quite sure we'll be talking soon then.
Great. Well, let's just gab at one point. Just shoot. We don't have to record it or anything. So.
It sounds good. Thanks again, Mike.
Great. This has been a wonderful delight. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm. Now, before I go, allow
Bye.
me to leave this with the listeners. The American landscape photographer and environmentalist Ansel Adams once stated, "We all move on the fringes of eternity and are sometimes granted vistas through fabric of illusion. Many refuse to admit it. I feel a mystery exists. There are certain times when, as on the whisper of the wind, there comes a clear and quiet realization that there is indeed a presence in the world, a non-human entity that is not necessarily inhuman." So I thank everybody for listening to the show and for your support. Good night and have a great weekend.